Well, Mike Harris's common sense revolution in Ontario reduced the number of municipalities from 850 to about half that over the course of years. But was it done at some kind of a cost? Well, we've got Matthew McGuire, president of the Toronto Taxpayers Coalition, joining us, and Adam Giambrone, of course, is joining us. Well, let's start with you, Matthew, first off, because this is a study that comes out of the University of Western Ontario that looks at the cost of amalgamation. What were they?
Well, the costs were significant. You would think that by reducing the number of municipalities in Ontario by almost half, by reducing the number of elected officials by 23%, that costs would go down. That's not the case. We see pre-amalgamation growth in government was about 24% over 15 years. It's been 39% in the 15 years post-amalgamation.
He's giggling.
Well, you know, there was a lot of discussion back over a decade ago about this with the predictions that there would be no cost savings. And the simple way to look at it was, you know, you had in Toronto, you had 5 fire chiefs. And so what happened with amalgamation is they went down to 1 fire chief, but it went to the highest salary of the 5. And then you went to the planning department, there were 5 chief planners. And so some areas had lower fire chief salaries, higher chief planners, or vice versa. But what amalgamation did in Toronto is you went to the highest of all levels. So instead of actually finding any efficiencies, there weren't any. And in fact, when the old councils, who were very much smaller and close, they could prioritize as their residents wanted. If the residents wanted more money on parks, they could spend that, or more money on you know, the planning department, they could do that. In this case, you got the government, as government gets bigger, it gets less efficient, similar to, in a lot of cases, big corporations who don't have the ability to look at cost savings as meticulously as a small business would when the owner is actually looking at the books each and every day.
It looks as though the number of jobs expanded to 270,000 people working in the public sector compared to 160,000 in 95. Wow.
That's an increase of 110,000 in basically since 1995, since amalgamation, and that's not acceptable. Now, part of the reason for the job growth is you would have rural municipalities with volunteer fire departments, part-time fire departments. When they're amalgamated to create megacities, these become full-time jobs. And Adam's already discussed the upward push on wages as a result of merging the collective bargaining units of the cities as well. The growth has been significant. We have right now $750 million annually spent on municipal wages in Ontario. In 1981, that was a mere $200 million a year. It's almost increased fourfold. That's not acceptable. It's not what we were led to believe when the amalgamation debate was taking place.
I mean, there is an important thing I think that needs to be brought into this debate, and not necessarily to defend that growth, but we should look at provincial and federal spending. I mean, provincial and federal governments over that time have had increases of government expenditures, and most of that goes on wages, of 4 to 6%. I mean, the federal government alone over the last 5 or 6 years has seen spending, you know, there's all this talk about cutting back, but in fact, the number of civil servants in Ottawa and the amount spent on wages, whether it be consultants or actual employees, has actually been growing at like 4 or 5% a year. There's been some dips in some years, and then it's galloped back. So this is actually not just a trend in Ontario. It's not just a trend. It's a trend across the country in both provincial, municipal, and federal governments, with some exceptions.
Downloading, isn't it, too?
No, well, I mean, there's downloading, but that just shifts spending from a provincial government to a municipal government. It doesn't actually change that. I mean, that's something that you need to bring into this debate. It's not just about municipal governments. It's about the growth of government and whole. In the case of municipal government, some of it would have been downloading. Responsibilities were transferred, so you'd have to do the analysis of looking at whether provincial money, actually provincial funding went, or spending on wages went down. My guess is it didn't, or didn't for a long, or might have dipped and then started growing again. And in the case of Toronto, when you look at the number of employees, I mean, municipally, some of that can be explained. You have a much higher population. Toronto has been growing. So, you know, some of that in terms of like TTC, number of drivers, you're going to have more drivers. There's you know, ridership on the TTC has grown by 40%, our public transit. In some cases, it's justified. In others, it's not.
Yeah, and your group did a study that this whole Sunshine List is exploding.
It is. In a single year, from 2011 to 2012, the number of Toronto municipal employees on the Sunshine List grew by 30%. And I think part of the reason would be the upward pressure on municipal wages here in the city of Toronto. But one thing that Adam brings up that I think is really interesting is the federal and the provincial governments and the growth in them. It used to be pre-amalgamation that the federal government had the largest number of bureaucrats. That's not the case today. Municipal governments in Canada have more bureaucrats than the federal government does, than any provincial government does. I think most of your viewers would be shocked to learn that, and that's one thing that Professor Cobbin has found in his research.
Except we have seen a shift of responsibilities. For example, if you look at this where the study dates, the pre-amalgamation, Toronto would not have been responsible for the housing corporation, and that's actually one of the now the biggest sections of municipal budgets is on the provincial, what was a provincial responsibility. Similarly, you know, some of the responsibilities in the fire departments have been shifted from the provincial fire marshal down to the cities. Toronto Police has taken on more of the investigative role that probably should be with the OPP. I mean, there's a lot of this, I mean, some of it is just population growth, some of it is probably unacceptable growth, and then some of it is a shift of responsibilities from one order of government. So, I mean, this raises an important point. I mean, you can't have government expenditures outpacing inflation indefinitely, but I think one level that, and I don't have this level of detail because the study hasn't been released, to look at is to actually look at, because you need to compare, you know, when the province transferred responsibility, did its spending go down and just transfer, or was there a net growth? All of those things. This is a pretty complex.
You know, it's
analysis.
interesting you're making this argument, because what I'm hearing from you is government's gotten too big, and yet you come from an NDP bent, and in the past they've said, you know, big government's good.
No, I mean, what they've said is you want to spend, you want to look at how you're spending your programs. I mean, the Conservative government has grown government faster than the Liberal government.
At the federal level?
At the federal level.
Okay.
You know, it doesn't always, even when you look in Mike Harris in Ontario, there was a massive cut in government expenditures in the mid-90s, but if you look at the end of the mandate, that trend had kind of reversed itself. And I mean, so it actually, this whole issue of growing government goes across parties, just where you spend your money, what your priorities are.
Well, this report does demonstrate that there has been some downloading, and certainly that has had an effect. But the number of jobs created in general administration has far outpaced the number of jobs in frontline service delivery. So I don't think that downloading has had as significant of an effect as some might think. Now, with respect to population growth, in 1995, we had in Ontario about 15.9 workers per 1,000 residents. Today, that's 20.9. That's an increase of 6 per 1,000. Population growth can explain that. We see here that the answer to big government is not amalgamation. It is determination. We need elected officials who are determined to cut red tape, to reduce spending, and to reduce the size and the cost and the reach of government.
Matthew, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Matthew McGuire joining us, president of the Toronto Taxpayers Coalition, our contributor, Andrew Giambrone. Good to see you, man.
Good to be here.